The Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he had said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. Blessed be to God.
Very nice, thank you. Grant, O Lord, that your word may be faithfully proclaimed, your word may be faithfully received, and your word may be faithfully made manifest in your world. Amen. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are reading the paper this morning, and you are discovering that roughly a third of it, sentences, have been removed. And you're trying to put together the story without all the details. Or perhaps you're working on a jigsaw puzzle, one of my favorite winter activities. Only half of the pieces are missing. And so you get an outline of the picture that will be there when it's done, but not the details. That is a little bit what it's like to read the Bible. You get the outline, but a lot of details are missing. There are a lot of gaps, particularly in the Gospels. There are a lot of things that are not only not answered, but questions that are not even asked in the context of the narrative. And it's left up to us to try to fill in the blanks, to figure out what lies behind the story and within the story and around the story so that the story itself begins to make sense. In some instances, it's really not that important. It would be curious to know why Joseph ends up in Nazareth and he's not in Bethlehem at the beginning of the Gospels. It would be interesting to know exactly at what point the parents of Jesus tell him about the instance of his conception and his birth. But there are other parts that's very important to know that information that is missing. And the Transfiguration is one of those. The Transfiguration is a pivotal event in the Gospels. It is a turning point. It's a game changer, to use a more modern phrase, to the narrative. And yet, most of the story is missing. Fortunately, we have some tools that we can use to try to make up for that difference, to fill in those gaps, to answer those unasked questions. We can apply logic, which will help us to understand what might have happened, what flowed from what we do know in a logical progression that makes sense out of the story. But sometimes we have to simply trust our imagination. Risky, yes, it can lead us astray, but sometimes it is the only tool we have to try to make sense out of that which we've been presented with in the Gospels. And that's what I've tried to do with the story of the Transfiguration. Because there's so much missing from that story that we really don't understand what's going on here unless we apply those two tools of logic and imagination to try to fill in the blanks. Let's look at the story. Jesus, I'm actually going to begin before the story starts, that reference at the beginning of the reading to something that had already happened the week before. Jesus and his disciples are wandering around the countryside of Galilee, which is what they spend most of their time doing, going from town to town. And in the context of that, Jesus asks a question. Now, it's a question that actually permeates the gospel. It goes back to the earliest times of the story of Jesus. Who is he? Who is Jesus? And in light of who Jesus is, what is his purpose? What is his goal in the activities that he's engaging in? And what does he hope to accomplish? So Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, there's some people who think you're Elijah, or you're one of the prophets returned, or maybe even John the Baptist come back from the dead. But Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And Peter, in his boldness, sometimes mistaken, but his boldness nonetheless, responds, you are the Messiah. You are God's anointed one. Now that's a very important statement. It's pretty significant to be the Messiah. Much more so than simply somebody who goes around and teaching and preaching and healing and trying to restore people to a relationship with themselves and with God. The Messiah is a very key figure, even though at the time of Jesus there was a lot of uncertainty about exactly what the Messiah was supposed to do and accomplish. But Peter says, you are the Messiah. You are the chosen one of God. And that seems to satisfy Jesus, because he drops the subject at that point. Until 8 days later. And they're still wandering around the Galilean countryside. Hopefully the weather was better than today. And Jesus tells part of the disciples to sort of wait over here for a minute. He's got some business to do. He's going to take Peter, James, and John with him, but the rest are to stay over here. And Peter, James, and John come with Jesus a little bit further on, and he tells them to wait there while he goes over there to pray. They're tired. Seems like they're always tired at this point in the gospel. And they watch and they see that Jesus is not alone, and he's not quite the way he was before. His garments are glowing. He's got this kind of aura around him. And he's talking with two people, two men. And one appears to be Elijah, one of the greatest of the prophets. And the other is Moses, the giver of the law, representing what we call the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. And he's discussing something with them, but they can't hear what's going on. Oh, how I wish we had CNN back then. I'd love to be the person listening in on that conversation, because it's such a crucial conversation that Jesus has with these two men. Peter sees this happening, and he gets a brilliant idea. Now, I dump on Peter a lot. When I was working at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, I had great fun. But in this case, I think Peter's not to be criticized. He needs to be put in context. Peter's tired. He's tired of wandering around the countryside. He's tired of not knowing where his next meal is going to come from, or where he's going to sleep a particular night. And the other disciples probably are tired too, and maybe even Jesus is tired at this point. And Peter would like to see this stop and settle down for a while. And he has this brilliant idea, very entrepreneurial. Let's create a theme park. And we'll have 3 tents in this theme park. And Moses can be in one, Elijah can be in another, and Jesus will be in another. And people will come and they'll pay admission so they can talk to Jesus or Moses or Elijah, whichever one they want. No more of this wandering around the countryside. We can settle down for a while. And that's Peter's proposal, which Jesus doesn't actually comment on, but a voice from heaven does, and says 2 very interesting things, and they need to be treated separately. The first, the voice says, "This is my son." Now notice, he didn't say, "This is my Messiah," or "This is my anointed one." This is my son. He ups the ante. And the voice, with quite a bit of anger, I think, in the context, says, "Listen to him." Which is interesting because at this point, Jesus hasn't said anything. But when Jesus does say something, Peter is not very happy with it because it's a profound statement. What Jesus says when he comes down from the Mount of the Transfiguration is, for the very first time, never happened before in the Gospels, Jesus says, "I must go to Jerusalem and die." Peter wants nothing to do with that. He tries to dissuade Jesus from that course, and ultimately, sort of with resignation, says, "Well, let's all go to Jerusalem so we can all die," which is about as meaningless as it could be. What has happened here is that Jesus is dealing with the issue of who he is. That he is, exactly as Peter has said, he is the Messiah. He is the chosen one of God, and he must decide what that means, what his purpose is because he's the Messiah, and how he's going to achieve that purpose. Now, people in Jesus' day had a lot of different opinions about the Messiah. Some people thought the Messiah was going to be a great warrior who would drive the Romans out of Judah and restore their freedom, to lead them away from slavery the way Moses had led them away from slavery in the past. Others felt that Jesus was going to restore the Davidic kingdom, the glory days of the Hebrew people, when Jerusalem was built, and then under Solomon the temple was built. All that wonderfulness was going to be restored by the Messiah. And others, I think including Jesus before this, as a part of the radical religious reform movement, said that the Messiah was going to restore the purity of the Hebrew religion, which had somehow lost its way. But apparently, none of those definitions are subscribed to by Jesus. Jesus believes the role of the Messiah is to restore God's covenant with the Hebrew people. To restore it, to heal it, to purify it, to complete it. How is he going to do that? Well, apparently he decides he's going to do that by going to Jerusalem and die. No wonder Peter couldn't quite understand what Jesus was talking about. You and I wouldn't understand very much about what Jesus was talking about if Jesus said to us, in order to restore the covenant of God, I need to go to Jerusalem and die, unless we put it into its context. The covenant that he's going to restore isn't the covenant between the Hebrew people and God that Moses created after the Exodus. The covenant he's going to restore is the covenant that God entered into with Abraham, the original covenant between God and God's chosen people. Now, in Jesus' day and in Abraham's day, any transaction with God was sealed with a sacrifice. We know the story. God enters into the covenant with Abraham and says, in order to seal this covenant, you must sacrifice your son. Abraham really doesn't want to do that. God reneges on the request and supplies an animal in his son's place. What if in Jesus' mind that meant that the covenant was never sealed? It never actually came into existence because the sacrifice that would have sealed the covenant was never offered. And what if he believed that if he offered himself in sacrifice, he, the Son of God, offered himself in sacrifice, that would undo that incompleteness and would make the covenant with God whole again? I wonder if that's what's going on here. I wonder if that's the product of this conversation that Jesus has with Moses and Elijah. That he, as the Messiah, has the responsibility of restoring the covenant between God and God's people by offering himself as a sacrificial sign of its completeness. None of that's in the Bible, I admit it. And yet, it makes sense. And particularly it makes sense if we remember something that I think we Christians totally forget. And that's that Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a Gentile. He wasn't a Christian. Odd to say that, isn't it? Jesus was not a Christian. He was a Jew. That was his worldview. That was his context. Our tendency is to look at Jesus through the eyes of Easter, through the eyes of the resurrection, and understand Jesus in those terms. But I think we need to look at Jesus through the eyes of a Jew, because that's his context. That's the worldview out of which he acted. That's how he understood the world. And as the Messiah, he was the Jewish Messiah. He wasn't the world's Messiah. He had come to restore the Jews' relationship with God. Yes, God did much more than that. When God raised Jesus from the dead, that all changed. But before that, what Jesus does in most of his ministry, and particularly what Jesus does in the events of Holy Week, make much more sense if we understand that Jesus' context was that of the Hebrew people. I don't know. I'm sure there are some people who probably greatly disagree with everything I've said this morning. Fortunately, we don't burn heretics anymore. But I would suggest that in an effort to try to fill in the gaps and make complete our understanding of the story, particularly this story, where there are so many gaps and so much information we don't have, to apply logic and to apply imagination may be the only way we can come to an understanding of who Jesus was, how it was revealed in the Transfiguration, and because of who he was, what he sought to do, and how he sought to do it. And that, I think, is our challenge as Christians. If we are going to understand this person we serve and call Lord, without knowing for certain whether we are right. Amen.